White cops arrested a black elderly woman, suspecting her of suspicious behavior. But they had no idea who she really was. This arrest will be their biggest mistake, leading to consequences they never expected. Before we start, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss new stories, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Dusk settled over the city, casting long shadows across the streets as the sun dipped below the skyline. The hum of traffic filled the air, blending with distant conversations and the occasional barking dog. Oak Ridge, a city known for its economic contrasts where wealth brushed shoulders with poverty, was caught between prosperity and neglect. Towering office buildings with gleaming windows stood just a few miles away from neighborhoods where crumbling homes and vacant lots spoke of years of neglect. Tonight, Dottie Freeman, the city's mayor, found herself driving toward the latter. Dottie was a woman of resilience, with lines etched on her face that spoke of a life spent in the service of others. She was in her early 70s, but her sharp mind and determined spirit gave her the energy of someone decades younger. A former community organizer, she had spent her life fighting for the rights of the underrepresented. Her ascent to the mayor's office had been seen as a beacon of hope for many, a sign that change was possible in a city struggling with systemic inequality. Yet, despite her title, Dottie had never let herself be confined to the polished walls of City Hall. She believed that to understand the people she served, she had to walk where they walked, listen where others ignored, and see beyond the statistics on paper. And that was precisely why she had ventured out tonight, driving herself in a modest sedan through streets that most of her predecessors would never have dared to visit after dark. She dressed simply, in jeans, a worn coat, and a scarf wrapped around her neck to ward off the evening chill. Her hands, steady and sure, gripped the steering wheel as she turned off the main road and into one of Oak Ridge's most troubled neighborhoods, Pine Hollow. The streets here were lined with dilapidated houses, many of them boarded up, their yards overgrown with weeds. Street lights flickered sporadically, casting eerie shadows on graffiti-streaked walls. In the distance, a group of teenagers gathered around a corner store, their laughter echoing through the night. Dottie parked her car near an old, abandoned building that once served as a community center. The building's windows were shattered, and the roof had caved in years ago, but the sign over the door, though faded, still bore the name Pine Hollow Outreach. She remembered when the center had been the heart of this community, before funding was cut and neglect took its toll. Now the building was a skeleton of its former self, just like so many parts of Pine Hollow. She stepped out of her car and took a deep breath, pulling out a small notepad from her coat pocket. Her intention was to gather first-hand observations, to see the conditions of these neighborhoods without the filter of city reports or the guarded responses she often received during official visits. Tonight, she wasn't Mayor Freeman. She was just Dottie, a woman looking to understand the place she called home. As she walked down the sidewalk, she jotted down notes about the boarded-up homes, the broken street lights, and the litter-strewn alleys. A stray dog barked at her before darting into the shadows. A few residents glanced her way from behind curtained windows, their faces disappearing as quickly as they appeared. Dottie understood their wariness. Too often, the presence of authority figures brought trouble rather than help. She reached the corner where the teenagers were gathered, and for a moment they fell silent, watching her with guarded curiosity. One of the boys, tall with a hoodie pulled low over his face, called out, "Hey, what you doing out here, lady?" Dottie offered a gentle smile but kept her distance, sensing their unease. "Just taking a look around, son," she replied, her voice calm. "Trying to see what the city can do to help." The boy eyed her skeptically, then shrugged and turned back to his friends. Dottie continued on her way, making a mental note to revisit the area during the day to speak with local residents about their needs. Her steps led her deeper into the neighborhood, where the lights grew dimmer and the sounds of the city faded into the background. She paused in front of a particularly run-down house, its windows shattered, the front porch sagging under years of disrepair. A swing set in the yard creaked in the wind, a ghostly reminder of better days. She made a note about the property, considering options for a revitalization grant that could help bring new life to homes like these. Just as she finished jotting down her thoughts, the crunch of gravel under tires reached her ears. Dottie looked up to see a police cruiser slowly rolling down the street toward her. She didn't think much of it at first. Patrol cars were a common sight in these parts, but as the cruiser pulled up beside her, the window rolled down, revealing 2 officers inside. Their eyes swept over her with a mixture of suspicion and curiosity. "Evening, ma'am," the officer in the driver's seat called out, his tone flat and distant. He was middle-aged, with a stern face etched by years of his own bitterness. "Mind telling us what you're doing around here?" Dottie slipped her notepad into her pocket, keeping her expression neutral. "Just taking a walk," she replied, her tone polite but firm, "looking at the conditions of the area." The officer's partner, younger and less reserved, leaned forward. He had a sharp, narrow face and a smirk that didn't reach his eyes. "This ain't exactly the kind of place for an evening stroll, especially for someone like you," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "You got ID?" Dottie raised an eyebrow at his tone but kept her composure. She had dealt with hostility before, though rarely like this, and certainly not from those who should be serving the community. "I didn't think it was a crime to walk in my own city," she replied calmly. "Why do I need to show you my ID? I haven't done anything wrong." The older officer's expression darkened, and his partner's smirk grew wider. "See, that's where you're mistaken, ma'am. You're in a high-crime area, and we've got reports of suspicious activity. So, I'm going to ask you again. Show us your ID, or we'll have to take you in for questioning." Dottie's heart quickened, but she stood her ground, her voice steady. "I'm not carrying my ID with me right now, but if you call down to City Hall, they can confirm who I am." The younger officer laughed, a harsh sound that echoed through the empty street. "Oh, really? And who exactly are you supposed to be, wandering around here without ID?" Dottie straightened her back, her eyes meeting theirs with a steady gaze. "I'm Dorothy Freeman, mayor of Oak Ridge." For a brief moment, there was silence. The 2 officers exchanged a look, and Dottie saw the disbelief flicker in their eyes. Then, just as quickly, their expressions hardened again. The older officer's lips curled into a sneer. "Yeah, right," he said, his voice thick with sarcasm. "And I'm the president. Hands on your head, lady. We're taking you in." Before Dottie could react, the officers stepped out of the cruiser, their hands moving to their belts. Dottie raised her hands slowly, trying to remain calm, but she couldn't ignore the growing sense of dread in her chest. The reality of the situation settled over her. These officers didn't believe her, and they had no intention of listening. She opened her mouth to speak, to plead with them to verify her identity before escalating further, but her words were cut off as the younger officer grabbed her arm roughly, twisting it behind her back. Pain shot through her shoulder and she stumbled, nearly falling to the ground. "Stop resisting!" the older officer barked as Dottie winced from the pressure on her arm. She wasn't resisting, but they didn't care. They had already made up their minds about who she was and why she was here. As the cold metal of handcuffs clamped around her wrists, Dottie caught sight of a few residents peering out from behind their curtains, their faces filled with shock and fear. She knew then that she couldn't let this end quietly. She had to stand up, not just for herself, but for all those who had suffered from such abuses in silence. Her fight was just beginning, even if the odds seemed insurmountable. And as the officers pushed her toward the back of their cruiser, Dottie steeled herself, knowing she had to find a way to make them listen, to reveal the truth of who she was and the deeper truth of the city she served. The inside of the police cruiser was dimly lit, and the air felt stiflingly close. Dottie Freeman, the mayor of Oak Ridge, sat uncomfortably in the back seat, her wrists aching from the tightness of the handcuffs. The metallic taste of fear mingled with anger in the back of her throat as the car jolted forward, its tires crunching on the gravel-strewn road. She could hear the officers' voices drifting through the partition, their tone mocking and dismissive. "Did you hear that?" the younger officer said, laughter bubbling up in his voice. "She thinks she's the mayor. Can you believe it? What kind of nonsense is that?" The older officer grunted in response. "I've seen enough liars in my time to know one when I hear one. Bet she's up to something out here. Nobody just takes a walk in Pine Hollow at this hour, probably casing the place for a break-in." Their words cut through the air like a knife, each remark another reminder of the deep-seated prejudices they held. Dottie forced herself to stay composed, even as her heart hammered in her chest. She knew she had to speak up, to at least try and reason with them before the situation escalated any further. "Officers, please listen to me," she called out, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'm telling the truth. I am Mayor Dorothy Freeman. If you check with City Hall, they can confirm my identity. There's no need to take this any further." The car slowed to a stop at a red light, and the younger officer turned to look at her through the metal grate separating the front seats from the back. His eyes were cold, and his lips curled into a sneer. "Oh, so now you're giving us orders, huh? You don't look like any mayor I've ever seen. Probably just another con artist trying to play us for fools." The light turned green, and the cruiser surged forward once more, taking a turn onto a quieter, darker street. Dottie could feel the shift in the atmosphere. The distance from the main roads meant fewer witnesses, fewer chances for someone to intervene. Her anxiety grew with each passing second. Despite the pain in her wrists, she leaned forward slightly, her voice taking on a firmer edge. "I have spent my entire life serving this community. You need to understand that you're making a serious mistake. This isn't just about me." The older officer cut her off, his voice rough and filled with derision. "Save it, lady. You think because you talk fancy that we're going to believe your little fairy tale? If you really were who you say you are, what are you doing out here without any protection? Huh? You think we're that stupid?" The words stung, not because they doubted her identity. Dottie had expected resistance, but because of the way they dismissed her presence in this part of town. Their assumptions revealed more than just disbelief. They spoke of a deeper disdain for the people who lived here, for anyone who didn't fit the mold of what they considered respectable. Dottie was about to respond when the car suddenly swerved to the side of the road, stopping near an alleyway that was dimly lit by a flickering street lamp. The officers exited the vehicle, and within moments the younger officer opened the back door, roughly pulling her out. His grip was tight on her arm, and she winced as pain shot through her shoulder again. let's see who you really are," he said, pushing her toward the wall of a nearby building. "Hands on the wall now." The order was given with a tone of finality, and before Dottie could comply, the older officer shoved her against the brick surface, knocking the wind out of her. The harsh texture of the wall scratched her cheek, and she could feel the cold seeping into her bones as she struggled to regain her balance. "There's no need for this," she gasped, trying to catch her breath. "I'm cooperating. I'm not resisting." The younger officer scoffed, beginning to pat her down, his hands moving roughly and without regard. "Resisting or not, we're going to make sure you don't have any surprises on you." His search was invasive and humiliating, and when he finished, he stepped back, crossing his arms with a smirk. Clean. Guess she was telling the truth about not having anything on her. Still doesn't explain what she's doing here, though. The older officer stepped closer, his eyes narrowing as he looked her over. Or maybe she's just better at hiding things than we thought. I don't buy her story. Let's take her in for further questioning. Figure out what she's really up to. Dottie's blood boiled. The humiliation, the unjust treatment. It all came crashing down in that moment. She lifted her head, her eyes blazing with a defiance that she had carried through decades of fighting for civil rights. "You're doing this because of who I am," she said, her voice trembling slightly from the combination of anger and the cold night air. "Because you see a black woman in a poor neighborhood and immediately think criminal. This is about prejudice, plain and simple." The younger officer's expression hardened, his face flushing with sudden anger. "You better watch what you say," he warned, stepping closer and towering over her. "We're the law around here, not you. I don't care what fancy words you use. You're just like the rest of them out here." The older officer began to reach for his radio, likely to call for backup. But then something shifted. A faint murmur reached them. Voices. Dottie glanced over her shoulder and saw a small group of residents starting to gather, drawn out of their homes by the commotion. Some of them had phones in their hands, recording the encounter. The officers exchanged a quick look, their confidence wavering ever so slightly. They had been expecting complete anonymity, but now they had an audience. And that audience was not just watching passively, they were speaking up, asking questions, demanding to know why an elderly woman was being treated this way. "That's Dottie Freeman," a voice called out from the crowd. "She's the mayor." "Why are you arresting her?" another person shouted. "She hasn't done anything wrong." The officers' expressions tightened as the situation began to slip out of their control. The younger officer turned back to Dottie, his voice lowering to a growl. "You think these people are going to save you? We know how to handle situations like this. We're taking you in whether you like it or not." But Dottie saw an opportunity. She knew that this could be a turning point, that with enough attention on the situation they might be forced to verify her identity before proceeding. She took a deep breath and raised her voice, addressing the crowd rather than the officers. "I am Mayor Dorothy Freeman," she declared, letting her voice carry through the night. "These officers refuse to acknowledge that, but I'm asking all of you to bear witness to what is happening here tonight." The crowd murmured in response, some nodding in agreement, others moving closer with their phones still recording. The presence of so many eyes clearly unsettled the officers, who hesitated for a moment too long. Dottie seized that hesitation, turning back to face the older officer. "If you're so sure I'm lying, why don't you prove it? Call City Hall, call anyone in my office. They'll confirm who I am." The officers stood there, their hands still hovering near their belts, uncertainty creeping into their eyes. The situation had become a spectacle, and now, the longer they delayed, the more the balance of power seemed to shift ever so slightly back to Dottie. She could see the gears turning in the older officer's mind, as though he was calculating the risks of continuing with the arrest versus the consequences if she truly was the mayor. The younger officer's voice was taut with frustration as he broke the silence. "Fine," he snapped. "We'll call it in. But don't think for a second that this means you're off the hook. We'll get to the bottom of this." As the older officer reached for his radio, Dottie stood her ground, her breath steady, her gaze unwavering. She knew that no matter the outcome of the next few minutes, she would not allow this injustice to go unnoticed or unanswered. And though the conflict was far from over, she felt a spark of hope ignite within her, because for the first time that night, she wasn't entirely alone. The air seemed to grow colder as the seconds ticked by, each moment amplifying the tension that hung heavy over the dimly lit street. Dottie stood still, her hands trembling from the chill and the lingering pain of the handcuffs. She watched the older officer as he reached for his radio, his movements deliberate yet hesitant. The younger officer, meanwhile, paced back and forth like a predator sizing up its prey, his eyes flicking suspiciously toward the small crowd that had gathered. "I don't know why you people are even out here," the younger officer snapped at the onlookers. "This is police business. Go back inside." But the bystanders, some of whom had grown up in this neighborhood, were not so easily deterred. Their murmured protests only grew louder, and a few of them continued to record the encounter on their phones, determined to document every second. One woman in the crowd shouted, "That's our mayor! She hasn't done anything wrong!" The younger officer's face darkened with anger, and he turned back toward Dottie, his hand gripping his baton. "You really think you can rally these people behind you?" he spat, his voice laced with venom. "You don't know how things work out here. This is the real world, lady. You don't get to just play hero and walk away." Dottie's jaw tightened as she struggled to keep her composure. The words stung, but they were more than just insults. They were a reflection of a deep-seated contempt for the very people she was trying to serve. Her heart ached, not for herself, but for the community that had endured this kind of treatment for far too long. Still, she forced herself to speak calmly, refusing to let the officer's hostility provoke her. "You are supposed to serve and protect this community," she said, her voice steady but firm, "not intimidate and bully them." The older officer had been speaking into his radio, his expression grim, but now he turned back toward Dottie, his eyes narrowing. "You've got a real attitude problem, you know that?" he growled, stepping closer. "You think because you can put a title next to your name that you're above the law. Not out here. Not tonight." Before Dottie could respond, the younger officer reached for her arm again, jerking her roughly away from the wall. The sharp pain radiated through her shoulder as he twisted her arm behind her back, forcing her to bend over slightly. "We're taking you in," he said through gritted teeth, his grip unrelenting, resisting or not. The crowd's murmurs turned into shouts of protest, but the officers remained unmoved, their faces set with determination. Dottie could feel her anger rising to the surface. Anger at the indignity of the situation, at the assumptions these men had made about her, and at the thought of being powerless in the face of such blatant injustice. But beneath that anger was also a deep well of sadness, knowing that this was not a rare incident but a reality for so many others who were not in a position to fight back. "Stop resisting," the older officer barked as Dottie winced under the force of the younger officer's grip. She wasn't resisting, but the words were an all-too-common script used to justify excessive force. The younger officer's hands moved to her shoulders, and with a sudden, forceful shove, he sent her sprawling to the ground. Dottie hit the pavement hard, the cold, rough concrete scraping her knees and hands. She gasped, the air rushing from her lungs as she struggled to push herself up, but the older officer was already there, grabbing her by the collar and yanking her to her feet. The metallic taste of blood filled her mouth where she had bitten the inside of her cheek during the fall. "You people never learn, do you?" he snarled, his breath hot against her ear. "You think you can walk around like you own the place just because you've got some authority? I don't care who you say you are." The crowd's anger grew palpable, voices rising in a chorus of indignation as they witnessed the rough treatment. One of the onlookers, a middle-aged man with a weathered face, stepped forward, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "Hey, take it easy on her, will you? She's not doing anything wrong. You don't need to hurt her." The younger officer shot the man a glare. "Back off," he warned, his hand moving toward his baton. "Unless you want to get yourself arrested, too." Dottie, still gasping for breath, found the strength to speak once more. "You're making a terrible mistake," she said, her voice hoarse but unwavering. "And when this is over, there will be consequences." The older officer's sneer deepened. "Consequences?" he repeated, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "The only consequence I see here is you spending the night in a cell for causing trouble." Suddenly, the radio clipped to the older officer's belt crackled to life. A voice on the other end spoke, faintly audible over the shouts of the crowd. "Dispatch to Unit 17. We've received confirmation. The individual in question is Mayor Dorothy Freeman. Repeat, the woman in custody is Mayor Dorothy Freeman." A momentary silence fell over the street, as though the very air itself had been sucked out of the night. The crowd's shouts faded into murmurs of disbelief and outrage, and for the first time the officers seemed to hesitate. The older officer's hand fell away from Dottie's collar, and he took a step back, his expression shifting from anger to a stunned confusion. The younger officer's face paled slightly, but he quickly regained his composure, scowling as though the confirmation did nothing to change the situation. "So what?" he said defiantly. "She was still acting suspiciously. We have the right to question anyone in this neighborhood." Dottie stood taller, though her limbs trembled from the adrenaline and the cold. "You're right," she said, her voice stronger now. "You do have the right to question people, but you don't have the right to assume guilt, to use excessive force, or to treat any citizen with this kind of disrespect, regardless of who they are." The older officer's face flushed with frustration, and he took a step forward, pointing a finger at her. "You still shouldn't have been out here alone at this time of night. What kind of mayor puts herself in danger like that?" Dottie's eyes blazed as she met his gaze head-on. "The kind who cares enough to see the reality of her city firsthand," she answered sharply. "The kind who won't be intimidated into silence." More murmurs of approval rose from the crowd, and Dottie could feel the momentum shifting. The officers were losing control of the situation, and they knew it. The realization seemed to dawn slowly, as though they were only just beginning to grasp the severity of what they had done. But the younger officer wasn't ready to relent. His grip tightened around his baton, and his expression hardened with renewed defiance. "We still have grounds to detain you," he said. "We'll take you to the station and sort this out there." Before the older officer could respond, another voice cut through the night, clear and authoritative. "That won't be necessary." Dottie turned toward the source of the voice and saw a familiar figure stepping out of a black sedan that had just pulled up to the scene. It was her deputy mayor, James Harrington, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a calm demeanor that commanded attention. His eyes took in the scene quickly: Dottie's disheveled appearance, the agitated crowd, and the officers' tense postures. James walked up to the officers, his voice steady and composed. "Gentlemen, you're going to release her immediately," he said, "and then we're going to have a very serious discussion about what just happened here." The older officer opened his mouth to protest, but the weight of the situation was now unmistakable. He unclipped the handcuffs from Dottie's wrists, the metallic click echoing through the night as he struggled to meet her gaze. The younger officer, still simmering with defiance, muttered something under his breath, but he too recognized that their authority had been eclipsed by the gravity of their mistake. As Dottie rubbed her sore wrists, James turned to her, his expression a mixture of concern and respect. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly. She nodded, her voice steady despite the exhaustion that had begun to seep into her bones. "I'll be fine," she replied, though the fire in her eyes told a different story. "But this isn't over." Dottie faced the crowd, her gaze sweeping over the familiar faces and those she didn't know. She saw anger, solidarity, and a shared recognition of injustice. "Thank you," she said to them, her voice carrying a quiet strength. "Your presence made all the difference tonight. But this is just the beginning. We have work to do." The crowd murmured in agreement, and as the officers retreated back to their cruiser, the reality of what had transpired began to settle in. For Dottie, the path ahead was clear. There would be accountability, there would be change, and there would be no turning back. The bruises on Dottie's wrists throbbed with each beat of her heart, a constant reminder of the night's brutality. Her legs ached from the struggle, but she forced herself to stay upright, her expression calm and resolute as the officers retreated to their cruiser, tails tucked under the weight of their shame. The flashing red and blue lights receded into the night, leaving behind only the soft glow of street lights and the murmur of the gathered crowd. James Harrington, the deputy mayor, stood beside her, his presence offering a much-needed anchor in the storm. The crowd, though beginning to disperse, lingered in clusters, whispering and pointing in her direction. Their faces reflected a mixture of relief, anger, and something else: hope. Dottie felt it radiating from them, pushing her forward even as exhaustion threatened to claim her. "Thank you for coming, James," she said quietly, her voice steady but with an edge of weariness. "But we can't let this end here. We need to address what happened tonight, and it has to start now." James nodded, his gaze somber. "I agree, Dottie. We need to make sure this doesn't get swept under the rug. Those officers crossed the line, way over it. I've already contacted City Hall to set up an emergency meeting tomorrow morning." He paused, looking her over with concern. "Are you sure you're all right to go through with this now? No one would blame you if you wanted to rest." But Dottie's expression was resolute. "Rest can wait. We have too many people who have faced this same kind of treatment without anyone to stand up for them. Tonight is about more than just me. I'm going to use this opportunity to hold the police accountable and push for real reforms." James didn't argue. He knew Dottie well enough to understand that her determination was unyielding. He pulled out his phone, quickly tapping out a few messages to City Hall and key members of the media. It wasn't long before a few local news vans arrived, lights flashing as reporters rushed to the scene, eager to cover what was quickly turning into a citywide scandal. Dottie took a deep breath and stepped forward to address the cameras, her mind already framing the words she needed to say. As the microphones were thrust in her direction, she spoke with the same calm determination that had carried her through years of fighting for her community. "Tonight, I was unlawfully detained and subjected to abuse by officers who allowed their prejudices to dictate their actions," she began, her voice carrying through the night air. "This is not an isolated incident. It is a symptom of a much deeper issue within our law enforcement, a culture of bias and brutality that has gone unchallenged for too long." She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. This time, the person they detained happened to be the mayor. But what about all the times it happens to someone without the privilege of a title or a platform? To the young black man stopped because he fit the description? To the mother treated like a criminal in front of her children? These stories happen far too often in neighborhoods like Pine Hollow, and it's time we put an end to it. The reporters fired off questions one after another, but Dottie remained focused on her message. "I am calling for a complete investigation into tonight's incident, and I will not stop until there is accountability. Additionally, I'm announcing an emergency session of the City Council to address police reform measures, including mandatory bias training, stricter oversight protocols, and stronger community involvement in policing." The crowd, many of whom had continued to listen from a distance, began to applaud. There were shouts of agreement, voices lifted in solidarity. The people of Pine Hollow had seen too many promises come and go without change, but tonight felt different. Tonight they had seen their mayor stand before them, not as an untouchable official, but as a fellow citizen fighting against the same injustices they faced. As the reporters dispersed, Dottie turned back to James, her gaze resolute. "We need to prepare for the meeting tomorrow," she said, "and we need to reach out to the community leaders and advocacy groups. I want everyone involved in this." James nodded. "I'll set it up. But you know there's going to be resistance from certain members of the council and the police union. They're not going to take this lying down." Dottie's jaw tightened. "Then we'll stand up to them," she replied. "This isn't just about politics. This is about people's lives." The two of them returned to City Hall, where the lights burned late into the night. Dottie and James went through the details of the incident again, preparing statements and gathering evidence. They reviewed the police department's policies and identified areas where immediate changes could be proposed. They drafted a plan to launch a community oversight board that would give residents a direct say in police matters and ensure accountability. Despite the exhaustion that weighed on her, Dottie's mind was alive with the urgency of the task ahead. She thought back to the faces of the officers who had treated her with such disregard. It wasn't just about those two men. It was about a system that had allowed behavior like theirs to go unchecked. She was not naive enough to believe that one incident could solve decades of mistrust and mistreatment. But it was a start. It had to be. The next morning, the emergency meeting began with the City Hall buzzing with activity. News of the mayor's unlawful detention had spread quickly, and the council chamber was filled with reporters, community leaders, and concerned citizens. Dottie stood at the front of the room, a sense of determination coursing through her. She could feel the eyes of the city upon her, waiting to see if this would truly be a turning point or just another fleeting promise. The council members filed in, their expressions ranging from concerned to skeptical. Dottie saw the police commissioner take his seat, his jaw set with a mixture of defensiveness and frustration. She knew this would not be easy. Entrenched interests would push back against any meaningful changes. But she also saw allies among the council members, leaders who had long advocated for reform, and she knew that now was the time to rally them. As the meeting began, Dottie took the floor. Her voice carried a steady conviction as she recounted the events of the previous night. She held nothing back, describing the officers' abusive treatment, their blatant disregard for her identity, and the underlying racial bias that had fueled the entire encounter. She could see the discomfort on the faces of some council members as she spoke, and she welcomed it. Change didn't come without discomfort. When she finished, the room erupted in debate. The police commissioner rose to speak, his voice measured but defensive. "While no one condones what happened last night," he said, "we must remember that our officers operate under challenging circumstances, and mistakes do happen. I believe the incident requires review, but we should not rush to judgment." Dottie's response was immediate, her voice cutting through the chamber with clarity. "This is not about one mistake," she said, meeting the commissioner's gaze directly. "It's about a pattern of behavior, a culture that allows such mistakes to happen far too often, especially in communities like Pine Hollow. We have to do better, and that starts with accountability, not excuses." The room fell silent as her words echoed through the chamber. She could see the shift in the atmosphere. A battle line had been drawn. It was clear that she was not going to back down, and neither were her supporters in the audience. The commissioner's jaw tightened, but he said nothing more, clearly recognizing that he was facing an uphill struggle. With the momentum on her side, Dottie proceeded to outline the steps she intended to take. She called for the immediate suspension of the officers involved in her arrest, pending a thorough investigation. She proposed the formation of a community oversight board to provide transparency in police matters, and pushed for comprehensive reforms that included bias training, new protocols for detentions, and stronger disciplinary measures for misconduct. The debates continued for hours, with Dottie fielding questions from council members, community leaders, and even skeptical reporters. Throughout it all, she maintained her poise, refusing to be sidetracked by the usual rhetoric of support and law enforcement. She made it clear that holding officers accountable was not an attack on the police. It was a demand for justice and a step toward rebuilding trust. By the time the meeting adjourned, there was still much work to be done, but Dottie had laid the groundwork for meaningful change. The council agreed to establish a task force to investigate the incident and draft proposals for the upcoming reforms. It was a victory, though not a complete one, but Dottie knew it was only the beginning of the fight. As she left City Hall, a group of young activists approached her, their faces alight with a mixture of hope and admiration. "Thank you, Mayor Freeman," one of them said, "for standing up for us." Dottie felt a warmth spread through her chest, the exhaustion of the past 24 hours beginning to lift. "I'm standing with you," she replied, her eyes meeting each of theirs, "and we're not stopping here." As the crowd around her began to disperse, Dottie looked out at the city she had fought so hard to protect and improve. There was still a long road ahead, filled with challenges and resistance, but as long as she drew breath, she would keep fighting. For Pine Hollow, for the people who called it home, and for a future where justice was more than just an empty promise. The weeks following the emergency council meeting were marked by a whirlwind of activity and tension in Oak Ridge. Mayor Dorothy Freeman, known to most simply as Dottie, found herself at the center of a fierce debate over police accountability and reform. The incident at Pine Hollow had sparked citywide outrage, and while many rallied behind Dottie's calls for change, others, especially within the police department, pushed back hard, unwilling to concede that the status quo needed to be dismantled. The police union was particularly vocal, accusing the mayor of turning her personal experience into a political spectacle. They argued that the officers involved were simply doing their job, and that Dottie's reforms would handcuff law enforcement. The atmosphere grew increasingly charged, with protests and counter-protests taking place almost daily, filling the air with chants for justice and defense of the police. Yet Dottie was undeterred. She continued to meet with community leaders, activists, and even skeptical council members, tirelessly working to build consensus around her reform proposals. Despite the mounting pressure, she remained calm and composed, her voice firm as she articulated the need for change at every opportunity. The tension came to a head when it was announced that a public forum would be held to discuss the proposed reforms, with the mayor, police commissioner, and other key stakeholders addressing the public. The evening of the forum arrived, and City Hall was filled to capacity. The crowd was a mix of residents from all parts of Oak Ridge, those from Pine Hollow and other marginalized neighborhoods, business owners from the city's more affluent areas, police officers in uniform, and a host of media representatives. The air was thick with anticipation, the kind that could only arise from knowing that history might be made before the night was over. Dottie sat at the front of the chamber, her hands clasped calmly in her lap. To her left was the police commissioner, who looked as though he was bracing himself for a fight, his face set in a hardened expression. Across from them, a panel of council members prepared to moderate the discussion, their eyes scanning the restless crowd. As the council chair opened the proceedings, the murmur of the audience faded into silence. "Tonight," the chair began, "we are here to address the proposed police reforms that have stirred considerable discussion in our city. These proposals have arisen in response to the incident involving our mayor, Dorothy Freeman, and the officers in Pine Hollow. We will hear from all sides tonight, and we ask that everyone remains respectful." The microphone was handed to the police commissioner, who rose to speak first. His voice was calm, but carried a tone of defiance. "We understand that what happened to Mayor Freeman was unfortunate, and no one should be treated with disrespect," he began. "But we must also recognize that our officers work in dangerous conditions, making split-second decisions to protect the public. These reforms threaten to undermine their ability to do their jobs and could result in more harm than good." A few murmurs of agreement rippled through the room, but the overall response was lukewarm. The commissioner's words felt rehearsed, lacking the urgency and emotion of the moment. When he finished, he returned to his seat, his gaze fixed stubbornly ahead, as if unwilling to meet Dottie's eyes. Dottie rose from her seat, taking the microphone in hand. The room seemed to hold its breath as she stepped forward. "I've spent my life fighting for this community," she began, her voice steady and resonant. "And when I ran for mayor, it was because I believed Oak Ridge could become a place where everyone is treated with dignity and respect. But that belief was challenged on the night I was arrested. I was thrown to the ground and handcuffed not because of what I had done, but because of who I was and where I was." She paused, scanning the room, her gaze falling on the rows of uniformed officers, the skeptical council members, and the faces of everyday citizens who looked up at her with expectation. "When those officers saw me, they didn't see the mayor. They didn't see someone who had dedicated her life to public service. They saw a black woman in a so-called high-crime area. And that was enough for them to assume the worst." Her words cut through the air, eliciting a mixture of reactions. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others nodded in agreement. The commissioner's expression remained stony, but a flicker of frustration danced behind his eyes. "But here's the truth," Dottie continued, her voice rising with conviction. "My experience isn't unique. It happens every day to people who don't have a platform, who don't have a title, who aren't believed when they speak out. And it's not just about me. It's about every young black man who stopped because he fits the description. It's about every mother who's treated like a criminal because of the neighborhood she lives in. It's about the systemic problems that we must confront if we are ever going to build trust between the police and the communities they serve. The room buzzed with the intensity of her words, and she saw the skepticism begin to melt away from some of the faces in the audience. She pressed on, determined to make this moment count. "I'm not here to attack the police," she said, her tone softening but retaining its strength. "I'm here to make sure that no one, officer or civilian, has to be in a position where a mistake or a moment of prejudice can destroy a life. Our officers need support, but that support should come in the form of training, accountability, and community oversight, so that they can serve and protect with fairness and integrity." As Dottie finished speaking, the crowd broke into applause. It started slowly, then grew into a thunderous standing ovation from the citizens who had come to hear the truth from their mayor. The police commissioner remained seated, his jaw set and his hands clenched in his lap, but even he could not ignore the wave of support that had risen in the room. Dottie returned to her seat, her pulse racing with the adrenaline of the moment. She knew that her words had struck a chord, but this was only the beginning. The real work would start after tonight, turning the promises made here into tangible actions. The council members took turns addressing the audience, acknowledging the need for reform while raising questions about implementation. Dottie answered each question with unwavering clarity, reinforcing her commitment to the Community Oversight Board, bias training, and revised use of force policies. She could see the tide beginning to turn, even among those who had previously resisted change. As the forum neared its end, the police commissioner spoke again, this time with a tone that carried a hint of concession. "I don't agree with everything that has been said tonight," he admitted, "but I understand that we have to find a way to rebuild trust. I'm willing to work with the mayor and the council to implement changes that will improve our department." It wasn't a full victory, but it was a start. The small shift in his stance was a sign that the momentum for reform was real, and that resistance, however strong, could be overcome. When the forum concluded, Dottie was approached by citizens who wanted to thank her, shake her hand, and share their own stories of mistreatment. As she listened to them, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. Her own experience had been painful, but it had opened the door to change that the city so desperately needed. She would use the platform she had to ensure that the promises made here would be kept, and that Oak Ridge would become a city where justice was not just a word, but a reality. The last person to approach her was a young black woman with tears in her eyes. She took Dottie's hands in hers and spoke with a voice that trembled with emotion. "I never thought I'd see the day when someone in power would really understand what it's like for us," she said. "Thank you for not giving up." Dottie squeezed the young woman's hands gently, her own eyes shining with unshed tears. "We're just getting started," she replied, her voice filled with quiet determination. "And I'm not going anywhere." As Dottie left the forum that night, she knew that the journey ahead would not be easy. The road to meaningful reform was fraught with challenges, and there would be setbacks and opposition. But she also knew that the people of Oak Ridge were ready to stand with her, and together they would build a future where every citizen could walk the streets without fear of prejudice or abuse. In the days following the public forum, the city of Oak Ridge buzzed with a new energy. The mayor's powerful speech had ignited a spark throughout the community, and the push for police reform gained momentum like never before. The demands for change echoed not only from the halls of City Hall, but from street corners, neighborhood meetings, and even some of the police precincts themselves, where younger officers had begun to voice support for the proposed reforms. However, for all the progress that seemed to be unfolding, there were still forces working against the movement. The police union ramped up its efforts to discredit Mayor Freeman, accusing her of unfairly targeting law enforcement and placing officers in greater danger with the proposed oversight measures. Their rhetoric grew more aggressive, warning of mass resignations and threats to public safety if the reforms passed. Despite the backlash, Dottie remained resolute. She knew there would be resistance. Powerful institutions rarely changed without a fight. But she had come too far and seen too much to back down now. The emergency task force convened to investigate her arrest had been making headway, uncovering troubling evidence of systemic issues within the police department, including patterns of excessive force and racial profiling, particularly in neighborhoods like Pine Hollow. The task force's findings soon became public knowledge, fueling the growing calls for accountability. With each revelation, the pressure on the police commissioner mounted. He had initially tried to paint the incident as a one-time mistake by two overzealous officers, but the evidence suggested otherwise. The commissioner, who had stood so firmly against the reforms during the public forum, now found himself at a crossroads: continue to resist and risk further alienation, or acknowledge the need for change. The first major consequence came when the two officers involved in Dottie's arrest were formally suspended, pending disciplinary hearings. It was a small but significant victory, sending a message that misconduct would not be tolerated. The Community Oversight Board, which had once seemed a distant possibility, was now on the verge of becoming a reality, with Dottie and her allies pushing for its official formation. But even as these steps toward justice were being taken, Dottie could sense that the fight was far from over. She received an invitation to speak at a city council meeting where the final vote on the proposed reforms would take place. It would be the culmination of months of work and struggle, and she knew that the outcome would shape the future of Oak Ridge for years to come. On the day of the vote, City Hall was filled to capacity once again. The mood was tense, a mix of anticipation and uncertainty. The task force had submitted its final report, detailing not only the events of the night Dottie was arrested, but also broader patterns of misconduct that pointed to a culture of impunity. The report's release had sparked outrage in some quarters and calls for restraint in others. The vote would decide whether the proposed reforms would be implemented, including the creation of the Community Oversight Board, mandatory bias training for officers, and revised use-of-force policies. As Dottie took the floor, she felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her. The police commissioner sat in the audience, his expression guarded but attentive. The two officers who had arrested her were also present, their faces set in defiance. Dottie knew that this was not just about holding them accountable, it was about confronting a system that had enabled and protected such behavior for far too long. She began her speech with a measured tone, recounting the events of that night not as a tale of personal injustice, but as a story representative of a larger problem. "What happened to me could have happened to anyone," she said, her voice steady but impassioned. "And it has happened to many who didn't have a platform to speak out or a title to protect them. We cannot ignore the fact that certain members of our community are viewed with suspicion and treated as though they don't belong in their own city. That is why we are here today." Her words carried through the chamber, resonating with the crowd. She spoke about the findings of the task force, the testimonies of those who had experienced similar treatment, and the need for structural change to prevent future abuses. This is not about punishing the police, she emphasized. It's about creating a system where both officers and civilians can be safe and treated with respect. The reforms I'm proposing are meant to strengthen our community, not divide it. When she finished, the room erupted in applause. Yet Dottie knew that her speech alone wouldn't secure the vote. There were still council members who needed convincing, and the opposition from the police union loomed large. The council proceeded to deliberate, with some members voicing their concerns about the potential impact on law enforcement, while others argued passionately for change. The police commissioner rose to speak next. He began cautiously, his tone less confrontational than it had been in the past. "I have spent my career defending this department," he said, glancing briefly in Dottie's direction. "But I also recognize that we cannot ignore the evidence before us. There is a need for change, and I will not stand in the way of measures that aim to build a better relationship between the police and the community." It wasn't an outright endorsement of the reforms, but it was enough to tip the scales. When the final vote was called, the result was 8-3 in favor of passing the reforms. The Community Oversight Board would be established, and the new policies on bias training and use of force protocols would go into effect immediately. As the vote was announced, a sense of relief and triumph swept over the room. The crowd erupted in cheers, with people hugging and clapping each other on the back. Dottie felt the tension drain from her shoulders as a smile spread across her face. She had fought for this moment, and it was a victory not just for her, but for everyone who had stood with her. The two officers who had arrested Dottie were not present for the final moments of celebration. They had quietly slipped out of the room after the vote was announced. The disciplinary hearings would proceed, and they would face the consequences for their actions. For Dottie, it was never about vengeance. It was about ensuring that justice would be upheld and that officers who misused their power would be held accountable. In the weeks that followed, Oak Ridge began the long process of implementing the reforms. Dottie worked closely with the newly formed Community Oversight Board, which included representatives from various neighborhoods, legal experts, and even former law enforcement officials who had expressed support for the changes. The Oversight Board's first order of business was to review past complaints of misconduct and recommend disciplinary action where warranted. Meanwhile, the bias training programs were launched across the police department, with Dottie herself attending some of the sessions to show her commitment to the initiative. She made it a point to speak with the officers, engaging in candid conversations about their experiences and perceptions. While some officers remained skeptical of the changes, others expressed a willingness to learn and grow, acknowledging that the old ways were not sustainable. The most significant change, however, came in the community itself. People who had once viewed City Hall and the police department with distrust began to see a glimmer of hope. The reforms, though still in their early stages, were a sign that progress was possible. Community meetings were held regularly, with members of the Oversight Board listening to residents' concerns and taking action to address issues. One evening, as Dottie was leaving a meeting at the community center in Pine Hollow, a group of children ran up to her, their faces alight with excitement. "Mayor Dottie, Mayor Dottie," they called out, tugging at her sleeve. "Are you going to make everything better?" Dottie knelt down to their level, a gentle smile on her face. "I'm going to do my very best," she said, her voice warm and sincere. "And you all are going to help me by staying kind, standing up for what's right, and always believing that change is possible." As she stood up and walked back to her car, Dottie glanced over at the old community center. The building was still in need of repairs, but there was now a plan in place to renovate it, to bring it back to life as a place where residents could come together, share ideas, and build a stronger neighborhood. For the first time in a long while, Dottie felt a deep sense of peace. The struggle for justice was far from over, and there would always be more work to do. But as long as she had breath in her body, she would keep fighting for a city where everyone could live with dignity and respect. The road ahead was still long, but Oak Ridge was moving in the right direction. And with each step, the city inched closer to becoming the place Dottie had always envisioned. A place where justice was not just an aspiration, but a reality lived by every resident. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you liked it and want to see more videos like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and click on the bell so you don't miss new episodes. Share your thoughts in the comments and be sure to watch our other videos. Just click on one of the suggested videos. See you in the next stories.